Damaged Defenders by Sherza. Chapter 58. Phil. It was past lunchtime before Phil was able to sit down in the office on his floor and really process events. Really, it was a good thing that he was both fairly phlegmatic of temperament and used to weird stuff and or insane antics. Dealing with Clint and Natasha and the sorts of missions they, as Team Delta, drew had been good practice. If circumstances had been any different, Phil had a feeling he'd be a gibbering mess by now. He was half tempted to fill Sitwell in on this nonsense because Sitwell would gibber and flail. Sitwell was a good man and calm enough most of the time, but he was really bad at hiding when he hit his limit of weird. A tiny corner of his mind was wanting to stomp its feet like a toddler having a tantrum, point at Stark and say it was all his fault. So by now, Sitwell would have been in high rants. Because, seriously, before that suit, all Phil had really had to worry about was Clint and Natasha trying to kill themselves in interesting ways and doing their level best to wreck governments and cities when missions went wrong. Then Stark, damn him, built that suit in a cave. Like that was a reasonable, sane response to the situation, and things had gone mildly crazy too. Well, this. Phil sometimes wished he'd tased Stark when he had a chance. The rest of him, of course, realized it was not, in fact, Tony's fault that the world had gone insane in the last year or so. It was just, well, it was how things had played out. That didn't stop the last, call it 20 hours just to be sure, from being a bit more traumatic than usual. Not that Phil would ever admit it. Being shot at? Hardly a new experience. That happens near weekly. Full-bore assassination attempt rather than a random shooting? Rarer, but it had happened often enough that it was old hat for Phil. Despite his bland businessman act, there were people that recognized he was dangerous in his own right. Finding out the would-be assassin was the legendary, and some claim non-existent, Winter Soldier, that had been worth a moment of disquiet. Those that knew he existed also knew that he never failed a mission. And even if that hadn't been a factor, the fact remained that the soldier was a product of the Red Room and its associates. Just bringing up the name was enough to make Natasha go all cold and remote, something Phil hated to see. Having him hurting her, hurting them, not good at all. Natasha was still picking up the pieces from her time subjected to the Red Room, still learning to be a person in her own right, with her own likes, dislikes, etc. Still learning how some emotions felt after so long pretending to feel those emotions. Phil had no idea how having the soldier around would affect her. He had a feeling even she didn't know that. And then they'd found out who the soldier actually was. As much as Phil, as a child and teenager, had wanted to emulate Captain America, and as much as even his older adult self still felt that way, as he'd gotten older, he'd begun to identify more and more with not Steve, but Bucky. Initially, it had been because Bucky was the sidekick, and Phil had been honest enough with himself to know he just wasn't the type of person who either wanted to or was likely to be cast as the hero of the story. He was the sort of person who was in the background. There had been a time he'd resented that fact of life a little, but then somewhere along the way he'd realized just how important the sidekick, the backup, was. And from Bucky he'd learned that sidekicks and backups could be badasses in their own rights. They just weren't as flashy as the hero. That Phil could handle. So Phil had recognized Bucky instantly, despite the fact the man's face, without the personality animating it, bore little resemblance to Bucky. He had also instantly divined that Steve was not going to react well to the discovery. Between the two, he had actually, for once, slipped up and shown how surprised he was. Phil just hadn't realized how hard the discovery would hit Steve. In his defense, no one outside of the Commandos, who had been utterly vicious about protecting Steve and Bucky's privacy in death, had really known just how close the two of them were. That Steve had gone behind enemy lines to rescue Bucky was a clue, of course, but it was incredibly easy to justify by any of a number of means. For hurt, Phil had expected. He'd even expected angry. He had not inspected the intensity of both they'd been subject to. For a few seconds there, Phil had honestly been afraid Steve would pass out from the shock. And he, like most of the others in the room, hadn't had a clue that Steve Rogers, of all people, could get and visibly look murderously enraged. Well over 12 hours later, and Phil was still stunned. The worst part of it was there was little to nothing he could do to help Steve. He knew that sooner or later the anger would not so much burn out as be begged, put on hold to dish out to deserving parties later. When that happened, Steve was going to fall apart. Again. After Steve had been defrosted, one of the first things he'd been informed of was the advancements in mental health care since Steve's time. That had been done in the hope that Steve would at some point avail himself of those services to make coming to terms with his situation somewhat easier. Phil could have told the folks who'd made those plans that it had never happened. Not because Steve was prejudiced against such things, but because he was as stubborn as a Missouri mule. He'd see a situation as his to deal with, and bothering anyone about it as pointless. He'd get through it. He'd survive worse. And that's exactly what Steve had done. He'd taken to destroying heavy bags with alarming regularity, but hadn't once spoken to a mental health professional of any stripe, regardless of whether they were attached to S.H.I.E.L.D. or not. After this, Phil was going to have to insist, because there was no way Steve was going to be able to handle what was coming without professional help. Above and beyond Steve's own issues regarding Bucky's death and the discovery of what had been done to him, having to watch Bucky work his way back to becoming Bucky was going to tear Steve to shreds. Phil and Clint both had needed a few sessions while Natasha was working her way out of the worst of the damage the Red Room had done to her, and they hadn't been emotionally invested in her the way Steve was with Bucky. And that was just Steve's end of things. This was going to hit, well, most of the team pretty hard. About the only ones who wouldn't be dealing with nasty personal memories being dug up by this were Remy, Jane, and John. Even Rogue might still have memories transferred from Logan. The worst part of it was that Phil was going to play hell finding someone trustworthy to work with the team. And then he'd play hell again, getting the lot of them to talk to said professional. Clint might be reasonable thanks to his trust in Phil, but even that was a mite. Oh wait, actually he wouldn't play hell finding someone. Didn't Charles have the necessary degrees? Yes he did. Well, that was one problem settled. Better, Charles could bypass a lot of the usual difficulties in getting people to talk using his mutation. Right. Call Charles. Phil blew out a breath and grabbed his cell phone. Xavier's School for the Gifted. Professor Xavier speaking. Charles, it's Agent Coulson, Phil said. We've had quite the evening over here. Phil then proceeded to fill Charles in. Oh my, Charles said. Yes, that would create rather a few problems for your team, wouldn't it? Yes, and the list of people who could even begin to handle their various needs, much less the security clearances required, is rather short. Phil said. Aside from one or two of the better professionals attached to S.H.I.E.L.D., I am about the only professional most of them would be willing to speak to. Charles finished. Exactly, Phil said. And even then, probably not without a fight. And yourself? Xavier wanted to know. To be honest, I'm still processing this myself. I'm mostly too horrified for much of anything else to register at the moment. I'm pretty sure most of the rest are the same way, Phil admitted. And the situation is further complicated by the appearance and capture of Belova. We could probably use your help with her as well. She proved remarkably resistant to my usual non-violent methods of information extraction, and I know from Natasha that resorting to violence would be useless. Nor am I confident we'll be able to hold her for long. Natasha claims Belova was second best behind herself, and I know that even Tony's cell couldn't hold Natasha for long if she was determined to escape. Tony was good. Better than good. The basement cell was more than enough to hold the average person indefinitely, and could probably hold Steve and even mutants whose powers didn't run to blowing things up, teleportation, mental control, or absurdly sharp claws. But widows were hardly average, and as good as Tony was, he hadn't had access to the sort of information he'd need to build a cell that could hold a widow long term. Simply because that information did not exist anywhere outside of Natasha's head. Not even Phil knew all of what Natasha was capable of. Most of it, yes. All of it, no. And what he knew, he'd never written down anywhere or spoken about to anyone that hadn't seen her pull that particular stunt to protect her. I shall arrive, say, after dinner, Charles offered, and bring Hank so that he might consult with Dr. Reyes as to the best options for anesthesia to remove the inimical hardware from Sergeant Bonds. I will also bring young Mr. Drake, as I doubt he would let me visit the tower without him. It will also serve to distract Rogue and John from the situation. Tomorrow might be better, Phil said. Less of a rush, and you can hang about all day to establish some sort of detente with the folks here that don't know you. Good point, Charles said, in the sort of tone that let Phil know he'd suggested tonight, knowing it wasn't the most viable idea. Tomorrow, then. First thing. I must admit, I am quite looking forward to meeting Thor and Loki. It is not every day one gets to meet aliens that were once worshipped as gods. Phil gave an amused snort. Curiosity is killing the cat, Professor? Quite so, Charles said. And when I get there, we can discuss in more detail how the Thanos issue will be dealt with. I'll ask Frigga to stay here until after you arrive. She doubtlessly has news from the rest of the realms, Phil said, and she will probably appreciate the chance to spend time with her sons. They could make a proper war council out of it, both to begin to deal with the Thanos situation and to put together a plan to deal with Bucky's captors once they knew who they were and where to find them. Phil knew better than to think that wouldn't be on the agenda for not just Steve, but the rest of the Avengers. Like he'd recognized earlier, pretty much all of them had a personal stake in this one way or another. The few who didn't would join the party simply to make it painfully clear to all and sundry that mucking about with an Avenger would lead to seriously unpleasant consequences at the hands of the rest of the team. Phil considered it for a moment. Actually, if you'd be willing to stay more than a day, I think it might reassure Dr. Banner to have you present when we attempt to work with Hulk for the first time. He's willing to try, but very nervous about it. And having someone on hand who stands a chance of diverting Hulk before we get to round up would be helpful, Charles asked. Actually, we have that end covered. Betty Ross can stop Hulk in his tracks without saying a word. I'm more thinking that you might be able to help us couch things in ways Hulk can understand. No one has any idea just what his level of understanding is. We know he has some degree of intelligence and an ability to use his surroundings to his advantage in a fight, but beyond that, it's complete guesswork. Ah, I see. Yes, that would be of inestimable value in the initial contact. And then, once you know his level of understanding, you can go forward from there, Charles said. Not to mention a training session with your team will help divert their means from the situation at hand. Yes, there is that. If I can pry Steve away from Sergeant Barnes, which is going to be a big if, Phil admitted.